A giant gives his own people the weapon to destroy him. Sounds impossible, right? But before we can understand why Yhorm made that choice, we need to go back to the very beginning of everything. Long before Yhorm ever existed, there was a world covered in grey crags and ancient dragons. Nothing changed, nothing moved forward. And then fire came into the world, and with fire came the difference between light and dark, between life and what was not living. This fire was called the First Flame, and it changed absolutely everything about reality itself. Lord Gwyn found this flame. He was the most powerful being of his age, and he used the fire to wage war against the dragons who ruled the world. Gwyn won that war. He built a kingdom. He created an entire civilization built around the power of that flame. The world entered what became known as the Age of Fire, and for countless years, everything was good. But here is the thing about fire. Fire does not last forever. Fire needs fuel, and the First Flame was no different. Slowly, over centuries that stretched into millennia, the flame began to fade. The light that held back the darkness started to dim, and Gwyn realized something terrifying. If the First Flame went out completely, the world would enter an age of dark. Everything he built would crumble. Everything he loved would be lost. So Gwyn made a decision that would shape the fate of countless souls for thousands of years to come. He walked into the kiln of the First Flame, and he burned himself alive. Not just his body, his very soul became the fuel that reignited the flame. This sacrifice worked. The First Flame roared back to life, and the Age of Fire continued. But Gwyn was gone. What remained of him was ash and cinder, the burnt remnants of what used to be the most powerful lord in existence. This transformation gave rise to a new title. Gwyn became the First Lord of Cinder. This name was not just about what happened to his body. It was a mark of honor. Lords of Cinder were beings who loved the world enough to burn their own souls to keep it alive. The problem is that fire always fades. Always. No matter how bright the flame burns after someone sacrifices themselves, eventually it starts to dim again. And when it dims, someone else has to step up and do what Gwyn did. Someone else has to walk into that kiln and become fuel for the fire. This started a cycle. When the flame grew weak, a mighty soul would offer themselves up. They would link the fire, becoming a Lord of Cinder in the process. The flame would blaze bright again for another age. Then it would fade. Then someone new would sacrifice themselves, over and over and over again, through countless generations. Every few centuries, the entire world depends on one person being willing to throw themselves into fire and burn away everything they are. That is not just a sacrifice. That is carrying the weight of all existence on your shoulders and choosing to be destroyed so that everyone else can live. Some of these Lords of Cinder became legends. Their names were carved into history, celebrated and mourned at the same time. But here is something people often forget. Being a Lord of Cinder was not just an honor, it was also a curse. You gave up everything, your life, your future, any hope of peace or rest. You became ash so that others could enjoy sunlight. And the cycle kept going, age after age after age. The First Flame would burn bright, then start to fade, and someone would have to make that impossible choice all over again. The world stayed in the Age of Fire because people kept feeding themselves to it. By the time we reached the events of Dark Souls 3, this cycle had repeated so many times that the Lords of Cinder were practically mythical figures. People spoke of them with reverence and with fear. These were the saviors of reality itself, the ones who kept darkness from swallowing everything. But here is where things get complicated. What happens when the Lords of Cinder are called back? What happens when the flame fades and the world needs to summon those who already gave themselves to the fire? The answer is that they rise from their graves. They come back not quite alive and not quite what they used to be. They are pulled from death to serve the flame once more. This is the world Yhorm the giant was born into, a world where the greatest heroes were defined by their willingness to destroy themselves. A world where the only way to save everyone was to lose yourself completely. And Yhorm would eventually join this cycle. He would become a lord of Cinder himself, burning his soul to keep the flame alive. But Yhorm's story is different from the others. His sacrifice was not just about saving the world. It was about saving his own people. People who had every reason to hate him. People who should have been his enemies. Understanding why Yhorm made the choices he did means understanding where he came from and what giants meant to the humans of that age. Because giants and humans have a complicated history. A history filled with war and suffering and grudges that lasted for generations. Yhorm carried all of that weight before he ever carried the weight of the first flame. The cycle of fire demanded sacrifice. Lords rose and fell, becoming Cinder so the world could continue. And somewhere in this endless turning of ages, a giant would make a promise that went beyond duty. He would give everything he had, not because the world demanded it, but because he genuinely wanted to protect the people he served. That giant was Yhorm, and his story is one of the most tragic tales in all of Dark Souls. The stage was set. The first flame waited, always hungry, always fading, always needing new fuel. And soon enough, Yhorm would answer that call. But first, we need to understand the bad history between his kind and the humans he would one day rule over. Because you cannot understand the full weight of what Yhorm did without knowing what giants meant to the people of Lordran and beyond. One of the greatest heroes in history was rewarded for his service by having his eyes filled with resin so he could never see again. That hero was a giant, and what happened to him explains everything about the world Yhorm would eventually inherit. Giants existed from the earliest days of the world. They walked the land when dragons still ruled the skies, when the first flame was young and burning bright. These were not mindless beasts or savage creatures. Giants possessed intelligence, skill, and in some cases, honor that rivaled any human knight. When Lord Gwyn gathered his forces to wage war against the ancient dragons, he did not turn away help from giants. He welcomed it, and one giant in particular became legendary during that conflict. His name was Hawkeye Goff, and he was one of the greatest archers to ever draw a bow. Goff stood massive, even by giant standards. His strength was immense, and his eyesight was sharp enough to spot a dragon across miles of open sky. During the war against the dragons, Goff led an entire battalion of archers. He and his forces would fire volleys of giant arrows into the heavens, bringing down dragons that thought they were safe above the clouds. Lord Gwyn recognized this valor. He did not treat Goff as a second-class soldier or a useful monster. Gwyn honored Hawkeye Goff by naming him one of the 4 Knights of Gwyn. This was the highest military position in all of Lordran. The 4 Knights were the greatest warriors who served directly under the Lord of Sunlight himself. And one of those legendary knights was a giant. Giants and gods and humans fought side by side against a common enemy. They bled together. They celebrated victories together. In the golden era of Lordran, cooperation between the races was not just possible, it was celebrated. Goff was not the only giant who served the gods during this age. In the great city of Anor Londo, where the gods made their home among towering spires and golden halls, there worked a giant blacksmith. This craftsman forged weapons and armor for the divine beings who ruled the world. He was trusted with creating the very tools that protected Gwyn's kingdom. These examples paint a picture of what could have been. Giants and humans and gods working together, each contributing their unique strengths to build something greater than any one race could achieve alone. The war against the dragons proved that cooperation was powerful. The peace that followed should have cemented those bonds forever. But it did not work out that way. Something changed after the dragons fell and the immediate threat disappeared. When people no longer needed giants to protect them, old fears started creeping back. Suspicion replaced gratitude. The same humans who cheered when Goff brought down dragons began to look at him differently. They saw his size and his strength, and instead of remembering a hero, they saw a potential threat. Hawkeye Goff experienced this shift firsthand. After the Great War ended, after he had proven his loyalty through countless battles, Goff traveled to a place called Ulasil. The people there did not care about his service record. They did not care that he was one of the 4 Knights of Gwyn. They looked at him and saw only a giant. The people of Ulasil imprisoned Hawkeye Goff. They locked away one of the greatest heroes of the Age of Fire, like he was some kind of dangerous animal. But they did not stop there. In an act of cruelty that defies understanding, they took his helmet and filled the eye holes with resin. They blinded him deliberately. They took away the legendary eyesight that had brought down dragons and left him in darkness. This was not justice. This was not punishment for any crime Goff committed. This was fear transformed into cruelty. The people of Ulasil were afraid of what a giant could do, so they made sure this particular giant could not do anything at all. They crippled a hero because his strength made them uncomfortable. What makes this story even more remarkable is how Goff responded. He did not rage against his captors. He did not try to break free and seek revenge. Instead, Hawkeye Goff turned inward. He spent years in that darkness, carving wood by touch alone. He created intricate sculptures and filled them with philosophical meaning. The giant who once rained arrows upon dragons now crafted messages about the nature of existence and purpose. Goff achieved a kind of enlightenment through his suffering. He found peace despite the injustice done to him. But his story reveals something important about the relationship between giants and humans. Even when giants proved themselves loyal and valuable, humans could not let go of their fear. Even heroes were not safe from prejudice. This pattern repeated throughout history. Giants would help humans. Giants would serve alongside them. And then, when the immediate danger passed, humans would find reasons to distrust them again. The cycle of cooperation, followed by betrayal, became almost predictable. By the time Yhorm entered the picture, this history hung heavy in the air. Any giant who wanted to work with humans had to know what happened to Hawkeye Goff. Any giant who wanted to lead humans had to understand that their subjects might turn on them the moment they felt threatened. The mistrust ran deep on both sides. Humans remembered times when giants had caused destruction. Giants remembered times when humans had repaid their service with cruelty. Neither race fully trusted the other, even when they needed each other. This is the context that makes Yhorm's story so remarkable. He was not stepping into a blank slate. He was inheriting generations of bad feelings and broken promises. When Yhorm eventually became a ruler of humans, he was trying to bridge a gap that centuries of fear had carved between the two races. Understanding this history helps explain the choices Yhorm would make. His attempts to prove himself trustworthy were not random acts of kindness. They were calculated responses to a long pattern of giants being betrayed by the humans they served. Every gesture Yhorm made toward his people was shaped by the knowledge of what happened to Hawkeye Goff and others like him. The golden age of Lordran showed that cooperation was possible. Hawkeye Goff's imprisonment showed how quickly that cooperation could collapse into fear. And somewhere between those two extremes, Yhorm would try to find a path that honored both the hope of the past and the harsh lessons it taught. But the conflict between giants and humans was about to get much worse before Yhorm ever took his throne. War was coming. Not the kind of war where giants and humans fought together against a common enemy. The kind of war where they fought each other. A king sailed across the ocean to steal from giants. What came back with him would destroy his entire kingdom. Ages passed after the events of Lordran. The world changed. Kingdoms rose and fell. The first flame continued its endless cycle of fading and being relinked. And in this ever-shifting landscape, a new realm emerged. The kingdom of Drangleic became one of the most powerful nations in the world, ruled by a king named Vendrick. Vendrick was not an evil man by nature. He built Drangleic into something great. His soldiers were fierce, his cities were strong, and his people prospered under his rule. But Vendrick had a weakness, and that weakness had a name. Nashandra. She came to Vendrick as a beautiful woman, and he fell in love with her. He made her his queen. What Vendrick did not know was that Nashandra was not human at all. She was a being of the dark, a fragment of something ancient and hungry, and she whispered ideas into her husband's ear, ideas that would lead to catastrophe. Nashandra convinced Vendrick to cross the seas and visit the land where giants made their home. She told him about a power the giants possessed, something valuable beyond measure. And Vendrick, trusting his queen, gathered his forces and sailed to that distant shore. What happened next was not a diplomatic mission. Vendrick and his army attacked the giants. They tore through their land with fire and steel, and when the fighting was done, Vendrick took what he came for. He stole the prized power of the giants and brought it back to Drangleic. His soldiers left behind nothing but destruction and bodies. The giants did not forget. They did not forgive. Their king was known simply as the Giant Lord. He stood taller than any giant before him, and his rage at what Vendrick had done burned hotter than any flame. The Giant Lord gathered every giant who could still fight. He built a fleet of ships, and he led his people across that same ocean, heading straight for Drangleic. This was not a raid. This was an invasion. The giants landed on Drangleic's shores with one purpose. They wanted back what was stolen. They wanted revenge for their fallen, and they were willing to tear down every castle and burn every city to get it. The war that followed was unlike anything Drangleic had ever faced. The giants were massive, powerful, and absolutely relentless. They did not negotiate. They did not retreat. Wave after wave crashed against Drangleic's defenses, and slowly those defenses began to crack. Settlements that had stood for generations were reduced to rubble. Forests where children once played became graveyards. The land itself seemed to groan under the weight of so much destruction. This was not a war measured in months or even years. This conflict raged for generations. Children were born, grew old, and passed away while the fighting continued. Vendrick watched his kingdom crumble. The power he stole could not save his people from the consequences of taking it. Every victory his armies won was followed by another giant assault. Every wall they rebuilt was torn down again. The war ground on and on, consuming everything in its path. The corpses of giants and humans piled up across Drangleic. Entire regions became impossible to inhabit because of the constant fighting. What had once been a prosperous kingdom transformed into a scarred wasteland where survival was the only goal anyone could manage. And then something strange began to happen. The bodies of fallen giants did not simply rot away. They took root. The immense power that flowed through giant flesh did something unexpected when those giants fell. Their corpses sank into the earth and began growing. Where giants had fallen, great trees sprouted and reached toward the sky. These were not normal trees. They were monuments to the war, living tombstones marking where giants had made their last stand. The forest of fallen giants earned its name from this haunting phenomenon. Walking through that forest meant walking among the transformed remains of an entire race. The war needed to end, but neither side could deliver a finishing blow. The giants would not stop until they had vengeance or extinction. The humans of Drangleic could not push them back across the sea. Something had to break the stalemate. That something turned out to be a single unnamed hero. This warrior rose from obscurity and did what armies could not. They found the giant lord himself and challenged him directly. The battle that followed was legendary. Two forces of incredible power clashing in the ruins of a kingdom that had been torn apart by their conflict. The hero won. The giant lord fell, and with his fall, the invasion lost its driving force. Without their king to lead them, the remaining giants scattered. Some tried to continue fighting, but were hunted down by Drangleic's surviving forces. Others fled into hiding, trying to escape the vengeance that humans now sought against them. The war was over, but the cost was almost beyond counting. The giant race was nearly wiped out. A species that had existed since the dawn of the Age of Fire was reduced to scattered survivors and prisoners. One giant, known later as the Last Giant, was captured and locked away in the very forest that bore the bodies of his transformed kin. He would remain there for ages, a living reminder of a war that had consumed everything. Drangleic survived, but barely. The kingdom never truly recovered from the conflict. Vendrick himself retreated from the world, consumed by guilt and the growing realization of what his queen truly was. The stolen power that started everything brought nothing but ruin. This war carved itself into history. Humans remembered the terror of giant armies marching across their lands. The few surviving giants remembered the betrayal that started it all, the theft that cost them everything. Trust between the two races, already fragile after what happened to Hawkeye Goff and others, was now completely shattered. Any giant who wanted to live among humans after Drangleic would face the weight of this history. Any human asked to accept a giant as their leader would remember the stories of the Giant Lord's invasion. The scars ran too deep for easy healing. And yet, somewhere in the ages that followed, a giant would try anyway. A descendant of conquerors would attempt to become a protector. A species remembered for war would produce someone who wanted nothing but peace. Yhorm's story is about to begin, but now you understand what he was walking into. He was not just a giant trying to rule humans. He was a giant trying to overcome generations of fear, betrayal, and war. Every choice he made, every sacrifice he offered, has to be understood against this backdrop of destruction. The war with giants showed what happened when the two races fought each other. Yhorm would try to show what could happen if they worked together instead. Whether his people would let him succeed is another matter entirely. The people chose the grandson of their oppressor to become their king, and somehow that decision made perfect sense. After the devastation of Drangleic, the world kept turning. New kingdoms rose from the ashes of old ones. New cities were built where ruins once stood. And in one corner of the world, a land emerged that would eventually be called the Profaned capital. But before it earned that name, before it became a place of significance in the story we are telling, this land experienced its own conquest. A giant warlord crossed into this territory and brought it under his control. The history does not record his name. It does not preserve the details of how he fought or how long his campaign lasted. All that remains is the knowledge that he conquered, and the people who lived there were forced to submit. This unnamed giant was a conqueror in the truest sense. He did not negotiate. He did not seek partnership. He took what he wanted and ruled over those he had defeated. The humans who lived under his control knew what it meant to be subjugated by a giant. They experienced firsthand the fear and helplessness that came with being ruled by someone who could crush them without effort. Time passed. The Conqueror eventually faded from the world, as all beings do, but his bloodline continued, and from that bloodline came Yhorm. Yhorm the giant was born carrying a heavy inheritance. His ancestor had been a tyrant. His people remembered what giants had done to them. Every time they looked at Yhorm, they saw the shadow of the warlord who had taken their freedom. He inherited his forebears' towering stature, that same imposing presence that had once brought a nation to its knees. This should have been a recipe for disaster. A giant descended from conquerors, living among people who had every reason to hate giants. The logical outcome would be conflict, rebellion, another chapter in the long, bloody history between the two races. But something unexpected happened instead. The people of the profaned capital chose Yhorm to lead them, not as a conqueror claiming what his ancestor had taken, not as a tyrant forcing his will upon the weak. They actually asked him to become their lord. The descendants of the conquered invited the descendant of the conqueror to rule over them. Why would they do this? The law does not give us a definitive answer, but we can piece together possibilities. Maybe it was fear. Having a powerful giant on your side is better than having one as your enemy. If another threat came to their doors, who better to defend them than someone with Yhorm's strength? Keeping the giant close and content might have seemed like smart survival. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Maybe Yhorm himself was different from his ancestor. Maybe through his actions and his conduct, he had shown the people that he was not the conqueror reborn. Perhaps they saw in him qualities that made them believe he could be trusted. We know that Yhorm eventually proved himself worthy of that trust, so it is possible they recognized his characters before he ever took the throne. Whatever the reason, Yhorm accepted. He became the ruler of a people who had suffered under his own bloodline. He took responsibility for a land that his ancestor had taken by force, and in doing so, he stepped into one of the loneliest positions in the world. This is where the name comes from. Lonely Yhorm. He was a giant surrounded by humans who had every reason to resent him. He was a ruler whose very existence reminded his subjects of their past suffering. No matter how hard he tried, no matter how good his intentions, there would always be a distance between Yhorm and the people he served. Think about what that must have felt like. Every day, walking among people who might smile to your face but whisper about your grandfather behind your back. Every decision you make being viewed through the lens of what your ancestor did. Never quite belonging, never fully trusted, always carrying the weight of sins you did not commit. Now there is a question that scholars and fans have debated for years. Who exactly was this ancient conqueror? The lore never tells us directly, which has led to some interesting theories. One possibility that many have considered is that Yhorm's ancestor was the giant lord himself, the same giant king who led the invasion of Drangleic. The timing could work. After the giant lord fell, perhaps some of his kin survived and continued his bloodline. Yhorm's appearance does bear some resemblance to the giants of that earlier age, and the idea of a people once subjugated fits with what happened during the war against Drangleic, when giant armies occupied human lands. If this theory is true, then Yhorm would be a direct heir to the giant who nearly destroyed an entire kingdom. That would make his choice to protect humans even more remarkable. The grandson of the giant lord, dedicating his life to serving the very race his ancestor tried to annihilate. Another theory points to a different figure entirely. High Lord Wolnir of Carthus was a warlord who conquered many kingdoms during his reign. He was called the Conqueror of Carthus, and his ambitions stretched across many territories. While Wolnir was human in origin, his corruption by dark forces transformed him into something monstrous and gigantic. Some have noted that the catacombs of Carthus sit geographically close to the profaned capital in the world of Dark Souls 3. Could Wolnir's conquests have reached this land? Could Yhorm somehow be connected to that legacy? The honest answer is that we do not know for certain. The identity of the ancient Conqueror remains one of those mysteries that the game never explicitly solves. What we do know is that Yhorm carried the weight of that legacy, whoever his ancestor truly was. He was born into a lineage of conquest, and he chose to make something different of himself. That choice defined everything that came after. Yhorm could have followed in his ancestors' footsteps. He had the power, he had the position. Nobody could have stopped him if he decided to rule through fear and force. Instead, he chose a harder path. He chose to earn the trust of people who had no reason to give it. The lonely giant took his throne not as a conqueror claiming a prize, but as a leader accepting a burden. And from that moment forward, everything he did was about proving that a giant could be more than what history said giants were. His people had taken a chance on him. Now, Yhorm had to show them that their gamble was worth it. Most rulers take power because they want it. Yhorm took power because someone had to carry the weight, and he was the only one strong enough to do it. When Yhorm finally sat upon the throne of the Profaned capital, he became something the world had rarely seen. A giant ruling over humans. Not through conquest, not through fear, through invitation. The people had asked him to lead them, and now he had to figure out what kind of leader he would be. The tension in those early days must have been thick enough to cut with a blade. Here was a giant, descended from the very warlord who had once oppressed these people, sitting in the seat of power over their lives. Every time Yhorm walked through the streets, people would have remembered. They would have looked at his towering form and thought about what his ancestor had done. They would have wondered if this giant was truly different, or if the cruelty was just waiting beneath the surface. Yhorm understood this. He was not foolish enough to think that a title alone would erase generations of pain. He knew that every move he made would be watched and judged. Every decision would be filtered through the question of whether he could really be trusted. The people had taken a chance on him, but that chance came with conditions. He had to prove himself. Every single day. So Yhorm made a choice about what kind of ruler he would be. He would not be a despot. He would not sit in comfort while his subjects labored. He would not use his power to take what he wanted, or crush those who disagreed with him. Instead, Yhorm decided to flip the entire expectation on its head. He would become their protector. The same strength that had once been used to conquer would now be used to defend. The same size that had terrified his people's ancestors would now stand between them and any threat that dared approach. Yhorm resolved to be both the weighty blade that cut down their enemies and the stone-hard shield that blocked any harm from reaching them. This was not a casual promise. This was a complete transformation of what it meant to be a giant ruler. Yhorm was not claiming the throne as a prize or a right. He was accepting it as a burden. His job was not to enjoy power. His job was to serve. When danger came to the Profaned capital, Yhorm did not send soldiers to handle it while he stayed safe in his palace. He went himself. When walls needed to be defended, the giant lord stood upon those walls. When enemies threatened his people, Yhorm was the one who met them first. His rule was defined by duty, not by luxury, not by self-indulgence, not by the accumulation of wealth or the expansion of territory. Yhorm ruled because his people needed someone to protect them, and he had the ability to do it better than anyone else could. This approach slowly began to change how people saw him. At first, they probably watched with suspicion. They waited for the mask to slip. They expected the day when Yhorm would reveal his true nature and become the tyrant his bloodline suggested he should be. But that day never came. Instead, they saw a giant who put himself in harm's way for their sake. They saw a ruler who asked nothing of them that he was not willing to give himself. They saw someone who treated the throne not as a seat of comfort, but as a post of responsibility. Did they love him? That is harder to say. The scars of history run deep, and it is difficult to fully embrace someone who looks like the monster from your grandmother's stories. But respect, that they could give, and over time, they did. Yhorm earned that respect through consistent action, not through grand speeches or empty promises, through showing up, through fighting, through putting his massive body between his people and anything that threatened them. Day after day, year after year, he demonstrated that he was not his ancestor. This was the burden Yhorm carried, the constant need to prove himself, the knowledge that one mistake, one moment of weakness or cruelty could undo everything he had built. Other rulers might relax into their power once it was established. Yhorm could never afford that luxury. He was always on trial in the eyes of his subjects, but he did not complain. He did not resent the extra scrutiny or the unfair expectations. Yhorm accepted that this was the price of his position. If he wanted to change what giants meant to humans, he had to be willing to pay that price every single day. The profaned capital began to stabilize under his rule. The people went about their lives with a growing sense of security. They knew that if trouble came, their giant lord would handle it. They knew that the massive figure on the throne was watching over them, ready to act the moment they needed him. This was Yhorm at his best, a reluctant ruler who never wanted power for its own sake. A giant who used his strength to protect instead of to conquer. A leader who understood that trust is earned through actions, not inherited through bloodlines. But Yhorm knew that words and deeds could only go so far. The fear of giants was too deeply rooted to be overcome by good behavior alone. If he truly wanted his people to feel safe, he would have to do something dramatic, something that showed them beyond any doubt that he was on their side. He would have to give them power over him. He would have to make himself vulnerable to the very people he ruled. It was a risk that no other ruler in history had ever taken. But Yhorm was not trying to be like other rulers. He was trying to be something new. The decision he made next would become legendary. It would cement his reputation as a leader unlike any the world had ever seen, and it would plant the seeds for both his greatest triumph and his ultimate tragedy. Because when you give someone the weapon to destroy you, you are betting everything on their mercy. And sometimes, even the best intentions lead to outcomes nobody could have predicted. He handed them the one weapon in the world that could destroy him, and he did it with a smile. Yhorm had been ruling the profaned capital for some time now. He had fought for his people. He had protected them. He had done everything a good leader should do. But he could still feel it, that lingering doubt in their eyes, that hesitation when he walked past, the fear that never quite went away no matter how many times he proved himself. Actions spoke loudly, but history spoke louder. And the history between giants and humans was written in suffering. Yhorm needed something more than good deeds. He needed a gesture so dramatic, so absolute, that nobody could question his intentions ever again. So he gave them the Storm Ruler. The Storm Ruler was not just any sword. This was a great sword of legendary power, forged specifically for one purpose: slaying giants. The blade carried within it the fury of storms themselves. When wielded properly, it could unleash devastating attacks that no giant could withstand, not even one as powerful as Yhorm. This weapon was the great equalizer. It did not matter how big a giant was, or how strong their armor might be. The Storm Ruler could bring them down. It was the nightmare of every giant who had ever lived. A tool designed to end their kind with terrible efficiency. And Yhorm gave it to his people. A giant ruler, knowing that his subjects still feared him, handed them the exact weapon they would need to end his life. He placed in their hands the means of his own destruction. He looked at the people who had every historical reason to hate giants and said, without words, that he trusted them more than he valued his own safety. No ruler in history had ever done anything like this. Kings built armies to protect themselves from their subjects. Tyrants surrounded themselves with guards and walls and weapons. Even the most beloved leaders kept some distance between themselves and those they ruled, some layer of protection in case things went wrong. Yhorm did the opposite. He stripped away his greatest advantage. He made himself vulnerable to the very people he was supposed to control. And he did it deliberately, knowing exactly what he was giving up. The message was impossible to misunderstand. Yhorm was telling his people that he had nothing to hide. He was telling them that if he ever became the monster they feared, if he ever turned into the tyrant his ancestor had been, they had the power to stop him. He was not asking them to trust blindly. He was giving them a guarantee. Think about what that meant for the citizens of the profaned capital. For years, they had lived with a giant on the throne. They had watched him fight for them and protect them. But somewhere in the back of their minds, the fear remained. What if he changes? What if his true nature emerges? What if we are just livestock being fattened for the slaughter? Now those fears had an answer. If Yhorm ever betrayed them, they could fight back. They were not helpless anymore. The Storm Ruler sat in their capital as a constant reminder that their giant lord had given them this power. He had chosen to put his life in their hands. The psychological impact was enormous. Suddenly, Yhorm was not just a ruler who happened to be good. He was a ruler who had proven in the most concrete way possible that he valued their well-being over his own survival. The Storm Ruler was not just a weapon anymore. It became a symbol of the pact between Yhorm and his people. The sword was kept in the capital where everyone could see it. It stood as a monument to trust, a physical representation of the bond between the giant lord and his human subjects. When people looked at that blade, they remembered what Yhorm had done. They remembered that their ruler had willingly made himself vulnerable for their sake. For Yhorm, this gift was probably a relief as much as it was a sacrifice. He knew the weight of the fear his people carried. He knew that no matter how many battles he won for them, that fear would always lurk in the shadows. By giving them the Storm Ruler, he lifted some of that weight. He allowed them to feel safe in a way that his protection alone could never achieve. There was also a practical element to consider. The world was dangerous. Giants were not the only threats out there. If something happened to Yhorm, if he fell in battle or was incapacitated, his people would not be defenseless. They would have a weapon capable of defending against even the mightiest foes. The Storm Ruler was not just protection against Yhorm himself. It was protection against any giant threat that might emerge in the future. This act set the tone for everything that followed. Yhorm was not going to be a ruler who took from his people. He was going to be a ruler who gave. His leadership would be defined by sacrifice, by putting others first, by making choices that benefited his subjects even when those choices cost him personally. The gift of the Storm Ruler was sacrificial and benevolent, two words that perfectly describe what Yhorm was trying to be. He sacrificed his own security so that his people could feel safe. He acted out of genuine care for their well-being. This was not the behavior of a conqueror. This was the behavior of a guardian, and the people responded. The lingering doubts began to fade. The whispered fears grew quieter. How could you be afraid of someone who had literally armed you against himself? How could you doubt the intentions of a ruler who trusted you with the weapon of his own destruction? Yhorm had done something remarkable. He had found a way to break through the barriers of history and prejudice, not by demanding trust or forcing acceptance, by earning it through an act of vulnerability that nobody could deny. The Storm Ruler would remain in the profaned capital for years to come. It would witness Yhorm's continued service to his people. It would stand silent as the giant lord fought battle after battle on their behalf. And eventually, many years down the line, that same sword would play a crucial role in the final chapter of Yhorm's story. But for now, it was a symbol of hope, a promise kept in steel, a reminder that sometimes the strongest thing a powerful being can do is choose to be weak. Yhorm had won his people's trust. Now he had to keep earning it, and the battles ahead would test him in ways he could never have anticipated. When the enemy came, Yhorm did not send soldiers. He went himself, alone, before anyone else could even draw their weapons. Many rulers throughout history have claimed to care about their people. They make speeches about sacrifice and duty. They talk about how they would do anything to protect their subjects. But when the actual fighting starts, those same rulers tend to find themselves somewhere safe, behind walls, surrounded by guards, far from the chaos and danger of real combat. Yhorm was different. When threats approached the profaned capital, the giant lord did not retreat to his throne room and wait for reports. He grabbed his massive machete and marched out to meet the enemy personally. He positioned himself at the very front of his forces, ahead of every soldier and every defender. He became what the histories would call a one-man vanguard. A vanguard is the first line of any army, the troops who make initial contact with the enemy. They take the worst of the fighting. They face the greatest danger. Most commanders would never dream of putting themselves in that position. They are too valuable, too important, too necessary for the larger war effort. Yhorm put himself there every single time. His fighting style matched his position. That enormous machete would sweep through enemy ranks with devastating force. One swing could clear a path through dozens of foes. The weapon was sized for a giant, which meant it was sized for mass destruction in the hands of someone like Yhorm. Enemies who thought they were prepared for battle discovered they were not prepared for him. The people of the profaned capital would watch from the walls as their lord fought for them. They would see his towering figure wading into combat, his blade rising and falling with terrible power. They would hear the sounds of battle and know that their giant ruler was out there, putting his body between them and whatever threatened their home. This was not a leader who asked others to take risks he would not take himself. This was a lord who insisted on taking the greatest risk every single time. Yhorm risked life and limb defending his capital. That phrase gets thrown around casually sometimes, but for Yhorm, it was literally true. Every battle was a genuine threat. Every enemy force had the potential to wound him, to cripple him, to end his reign permanently. Giants were powerful, but they were not invincible. Yhorm knew he could be hurt, he knew he could fall, and he fought anyway. Why would he do this? He could have commanded from safety. Nobody would have blamed him for staying behind the lines. The strategic value of a leader surviving to coordinate future battles was obvious. But Yhorm's sense of duty would not allow him to send others into danger while he remained comfortable. There was probably another reason too. Yhorm was still proving himself. Every battle where he fought at the front was another demonstration that he was on his people's side. Every enemy he cut down was another piece of evidence that his strength belonged to them. He could not erase the history between giants and humans, but he could write new chapters in that history with every swing of his blade. The impact on his subjects was powerful. Here was a giant, the descendant of their oppressor, throwing himself into harm's way for their sake. Here was proof that Yhorm was not just talking about protecting them. He was actually doing it in the most direct and dangerous way possible. How could anyone doubt his commitment after watching him fight like that? Many of the people who once cursed giants began to change their minds. They had grown up hearing stories about giant cruelty and giant tyranny. Now they were witnessing something completely different, a giant who bled for them, a giant who could have crushed them but chose to defend them instead. The old stories did not match what they saw with their own eyes. Over time, fear began to transform into something closer to admiration. The people still respected Yhorm's power. They still understood what he was capable of. But that understanding became a source of comfort instead of anxiety. Their lord was terrifying in battle, and that was a good thing. It meant their enemies had something to fear. Yhorm earned a new title during these years of fighting: the reclusive lord of the Profaned capital. The first part of that name might seem strange for someone who threw himself into battle so eagerly, but it makes sense when you think about it. Yhorm was stoic by nature. He did not seek attention or praise. He did not hold grand celebrations after his victories. He fought when fighting was needed, and then he returned to his duties without fanfare. His personality was quiet, reserved, focused on the work at hand. He was not trying to build a legend. He was trying to protect his home. The reclusive nature also spoke to his position as a giant among humans. No matter how much his people came to respect him, Yhorm remained somewhat apart. He could never fully blend in. He could never be just another citizen. His size alone ensured that he would always stand out, always be slightly removed from the everyday life of the capital. But that distance did not diminish what he meant to them. Yhorm became the beloved protector of his city. Beloved, even if still somewhat feared. The fear was not the old terror of giant oppression anymore. It was the healthy respect you feel for someone whose power keeps you safe. The kind of fear that reminds you just how lucky you are to have such a defender on your side. Battle after battle, year after year, Yhorm proved himself. He cleaved through invading forces. He stood against demons that roamed the dark corners of the world. He faced whatever threats emerged and defeated them with his own hands. The one-man Vanguard never wavered, never hesitated, never put his own safety above the safety of his people. This was Yhorm at the height of his power, a giant lord who had earned the trust of his subjects through action and sacrifice. A ruler who led from the front and fought harder than anyone he commanded. A protector whose very presence made enemies think twice about attacking the profaned capital. But even the mightiest warrior has vulnerabilities. Even the strongest heart can be broken. And somewhere along the way, Yhorm would lose something precious, something that would change him forever. The battles tested his body and his courage. What came next would test his soul. Yhorm threw away his shield and never picked it up again. Not because he did not need it, because he could not bear to carry it anymore. The giant lord had experienced triumph after triumph. He had won the trust of his people. He had defended the profaned capital against every threat that dared approach. He had proven himself as a ruler and as a warrior. But none of that success could protect him from what happened next. Yhorm lost someone dear to him. The lore does not tell us who this person was. We do not know their name or their relationship to the giant lord. It might have been a family member. It might have been a close friend who had stood by Yhorm through all his struggles. It might have been an advisor who helped him navigate the complexities of ruling humans. It might have been a subject who had shown him kindness when others still looked at him with fear. What we do know is that this loss shattered something inside Yhorm. Here was a giant who had faced down armies without flinching. A warrior who charged into battle ahead of everyone else and laughed at danger. A ruler whose strength seemed limitless and whose courage never wavered. And yet this loss brought him to his knees in a way that no enemy ever could. It is a reminder that power does not make you immune to grief. Being strong does not mean you cannot be broken. Yhorm had the physical ability to crush mountains, but he was still capable of feeling pain that no amount of strength could overcome. The loss changed him permanently and completely. Before this tragedy, Yhorm fought with two weapons. His enormous machete served as his primary instrument of destruction, but he also carried a great shield into battle. This shield was sized for a giant, which meant it could block attacks that would demolish ordinary defenses. It was part of his fighting style, part of his identity as a warrior. The machete to strike and the shield to protect. After the loss, Yhorm abandoned that shield completely. He did not just stop using it occasionally. He forsook it entirely. He swore never to lift it again. The massive shield that had protected him through countless battles was cast aside like it meant nothing. And from that day forward, Yhorm fought without any defense at all. Why would a warrior abandon his protection at the peak of his power? The answer lies in the emotional weight of what had happened. Yhorm was known as a shield to his people. His entire identity was built around protecting others, and now someone he cared about was gone. Someone he had failed to shield from whatever took them away. The guilt must have been overwhelming. Here was a giant who could stop armies, who could stand between his people and any threat, who had made protection his entire purpose. And he could not save one person who mattered to him. The shield that had blocked so many attacks had not been enough when it truly counted. So Yhorm rejected it. He could not bear to carry the symbol of his failure into battle anymore. Every time he looked at that shield, he would remember the person he could not protect. Every time he raised it, he would feel the weight of his loss pressing down on him. It was easier to throw it away than to face those feelings every single day. But Yhorm did not simply become weaker without his shield. He adapted in a way that spoke to his emotional state. He took his enormous machete and modified it. He carved notches into the handle to allow for a better two-handed grip. This modification meant he could now wield the blade with both hands free, swinging it with even greater power than before. The change transformed his fighting style completely. Before, Yhorm had been balanced with offense and defense working together in harmony. Now, he was pure aggression. Every swing carried the full force of his massive frame. His attacks became wider, more devastating, more reckless. He traded the security of defense for raw, unleashed power. In battle, Yhorm became something terrifying. Without a shield to worry about, he could throw himself at enemies with complete abandon. His two-handed strikes would cleave through entire groups of foes in single sweeping motions. The machete that had already been deadly now became catastrophic. But there was something desperate about this new style. Yhorm fought like he did not care what happened to him anymore. He took hits he should have blocked. He left openings that a shield would have covered. He put himself in danger that his old fighting style would have avoided. It was as if the loss had made him indifferent to his own survival. His fighting now mirrored his emotional state, powerful and unyielding and tinged with a rage born from grief. Every strike carried the weight of what he had lost. Every swing was fueled by the guilt he could not escape. Yhorm was still protecting his people, still serving as their weapon against the darkness, but now he was doing it with a fury that came from a broken heart. The people of the profaned capital would have noticed the change. Their lord still defended them. Their lord still charged into battle at the front of every fight. But something was different now. There was an edge to his movements, a recklessness that had not been there before. The stoic giant who had fought with such controlled precision now attacked with wild intensity. Some might have thought he had become even more formidable. And in a way, they would have been right. A warrior who does not fear for his own safety is dangerous in ways that a cautious fighter can never be. Yhorm without his shield was capable of destruction that Yhorm with his shield would have held back. But others might have recognized the truth. This was not confidence or bravery. This was grief transformed into violence. This was a giant who had lost something precious and was now pouring all of that pain into the only thing he knew how to do, which was fighting and destroying and protecting others. because he could not protect the one who mattered most. Yhorm carried his modified machete into every battle from that point forward. The notched handle was a permanent reminder of what he had given up. Every time he gripped that weapon, he felt the grooves he had carved into it. Every time he swung it with both hands, he remembered why he no longer needed to hold anything in the other. The shield was gone forever. The pain would stay with him for the rest of his existence, and greater trials were still ahead. The profaned capital would soon face a threat that no amount of fury or strength could cut down. A threat that would force Yhorm to make the ultimate sacrifice. A threat born not from outside enemies, but from something dark and terrible within his own city. The fire started inside the city, and it would never stop burning. Yhorm had faced armies. He had stood against demons and invaders and every kind of threat the dark world could throw at him. His machete had cut down countless enemies. His body had taken wounds that would have ended lesser warriors. Through it all, he had protected the profaned capital with everything he had. But you cannot swing a sword at fire. You cannot block flames with muscle and bone. And the threat that emerged from within his own city was something Yhorm had no way to fight. It started with a curse. Somewhere in the profaned capital lived an oracle, a seer of some kind whose family would become the center of a nightmare. 4 women related to this oracle became afflicted by something terrible. A curse took hold of them, and what happened next defies easy description. Their bodies changed, and their souls twisted into something unrecognizable. These 4 women, who had once been ordinary people, living ordinary lives in Yhorm's capital, transformed into something monstrous. The curse reshaped them into bloated, grotesque creatures that the histories would later call the monstrosities of sin. These beings no longer resembled the women they had once been. They became mindless things, driven by greed and hunger. Whatever humanity they possessed was stripped away by the curse, leaving only malformed shells that moved and fed and existed without purpose or conscience. The most disturbing part was how they reacted to what they had become. They seemed utterly untroubled by it, showing no grief for their lost humanity and no horror at their transformation, just empty acceptance of their new monstrous forms. But the transformation of these 4 women was not the worst part. Their curse did something else. Something that would doom the entire profaned capital. The curse triggered the birth of the profaned flame. This was not ordinary fire. This was not the kind of blaze that could be fought with water or smothered with sand. The profaned flame was something entirely different. A conflagration born from darkness itself. It erupted within the city like a living thing, spreading its unnatural light through streets and buildings that had never known such horror. The defining characteristic of the profaned flame was simple and terrifying. It never went out. No matter what anyone did, no matter what methods they tried, this fire could not be extinguished. It burned and burned and burned, feeding on something beyond normal fuel. The flame was cursed to exist forever, an eternal inferno that would consume everything it touched. The lore tells us that this flame was connected to the abyss, to the dark that lurked beneath the surface of reality. It was not just fire. It was a malignant force with something like intelligence behind it. The profaned flame did not simply burn, but seemed to hate with a terrible purpose. It sought to destroy everything in its path and fed on life and fear with a hunger that could never be satisfied. Picture the scene that must have unfolded in the profaned capital. Portions of the city suddenly ablaze with eerie, unnatural fire. Soldiers rushing to contain it, throwing water that evaporated before it could touch the flames. Sorcerers attempting magical countermeasures that fizzled against the curse's power. Citizens fleeing from districts that were being consumed, only to find the fire spreading faster than they could run. Nothing worked. Every attempt to stop the profaned flame failed. The people of the capital had never faced anything like this. Their walls could not hold it back. Their weapons were useless against it. Their giant lord, who had protected them from every other threat, could not cut down an enemy made of fire and darkness. Yhorm must have watched in horror as his city began to burn. This was not an invading army he could meet on the battlefield. This was not a demon he could challenge to single combat. The profaned flame was everywhere and nowhere, a disaster that could not be fought with strength or courage or any of the qualities that had made Yhorm the protector of his people. For the first time since taking the throne, Yhorm faced a problem he could not solve. The panic that swept through the profaned capital must have been overwhelming. People who had learned to trust their giant lord now looked to him for salvation from something he could not provide. The flame continued spreading, continued burning, continued devouring everything in its path, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. This was the curse of the profaned flame, not just its destructive power, but the hopelessness it brought with it. Against an army, you could fight back. Against a monster, you could stand your ground. Against a fire that never dies, that seems to hunt for life, that resists every attempt at containment, what can anyone do? The monstrosities of sin, those transformed relatives of the oracle, wandered through the chaos, seemingly indifferent to the destruction around them. They had caused this catastrophe through their curse, and they felt nothing about it. Their mindless greed continued, even as the city burned. They were symptoms of the same dark power that had birthed the flame, creatures of sin walking through a world being consumed by their creation. Yhorm had built his entire identity around being the shield of his people. He had given them a weapon to strike him down if he ever failed them. He had charged into battle ahead of everyone else, putting his body between his subjects and every threat. And now, when they needed him most, his strength was meaningless. What do you do when the enemy is something you cannot fight? What do you do when protecting your people requires something beyond swinging a blade? Yhorm was about to face the most impossible choice of his existence. The profaned flame demanded a solution that no warrior could provide through combat alone. The fire continued burning, and the people continued suffering. And somewhere in the heart of that chaos, Yhorm made a decision that would change everything. He would find a way to stop this flame, even if it cost him everything he had left, because there was one power in the world that might be able to counter the profaned flame. One fire that could potentially suppress another. The first flame, the source of all light and warmth, the eternal blaze that had defined the age of fire since Lord Gwyn first sacrificed himself to keep it burning. If Yhorm could link that flame, if he could add his own soul to its fuel, perhaps the renewed power of the first flame could extinguish the cursed fire consuming his city. It was desperate and unheard of in its reasoning, but it was the only option left. The giant lord who had fought so hard to live for his people, now prepared to end his life for them. The ultimate sacrifice was the only card he had left to play. In the darkest moment of his life, the lonely giant found the one thing he never expected to have, which was a true friend. Yhorm had earned respect from his people. He had earned their trust through sacrifice and battle. But friendship, real, genuine friendship, that was something different. You cannot earn friendship through heroic deeds alone. Friendship requires connection, understanding, and the kind of bond that forms when two souls recognize something in each other. Sigurd of Katarina was not the kind of person you would expect to befriend a giant lord. He came from the land of Katarina, a place famous for its knights who wore armor shaped like onions. These warriors were known for their jovial spirits and their love of good company. Sigurd embodied everything his homeland represented. He was warm, friendly, and possessed the kind of cheerful nature that could brighten even the darkest circumstances. How did a giant lord of the profaned capital and an onion knight from Katarina first meet? The lore does not tell us the specifics. Maybe Sigurd was traveling through and stopped to pay respects to the famous giant ruler. Maybe they crossed paths during one of Yhorm's many battles and Sigurd fought alongside him. Maybe they simply shared a drink at some point and discovered they enjoyed each other's company. What we do know is that their friendship was real and it was deep. The lore explicitly calls Yhorm lonely and notes that Sigurd became a dear friend to him. Yhorm, who had spent his entire reign trying to bridge the gap between himself and his human subjects, finally found someone who saw him as more than a ruler or a protector or a giant. Sigurd saw him as a person worth knowing. Sigurd's affable nature likely cut through the walls Yhorm had built around himself. The giant had experienced so much loss and carried so much responsibility. He fought alone at the front of every battle. He bore the weight of his ancestors' sins. He had forsaken his shield after losing someone precious. All of that isolation must have created a kind of armor around his heart, a protection against further pain. And then along came this cheerful knight in ridiculous armor, probably offering to share a drink and telling jokes that had no business being as funny as they were. Sigurd's warmth would have been impossible to resist. His genuine good nature would have slowly worn down Yhorm's defenses until the giant found himself actually enjoying someone's company for its own sake. For Sigurd's part, he would have recognized something admirable in Yhorm. Here was a giant who had chosen to protect humans instead of dominating them. Here was a ruler who led from the front and put himself in danger for his subjects. Here was someone whose honor and valor matched anything the Knights of Katarina held dear. Sigurd would have respected Yhorm deeply, and that respect would have grown into genuine affection. Their friendship represented everything Yhorm had been working toward. A giant and a human, bound not by duty or fear or obligation, but by simple, mutual regard. If these two could become dear friends despite all the history between their races, then maybe the gap between giants and humans was not as unbridgeable as everyone believed. But this friendship would be tested in the cruelest possible way. As the profaned flame continued its destruction, Yhorm made his decision. He would link the first flame and become a lord of Cinder. He would burn his own soul to hopefully stop the cursed fire consuming his city. It was a sacrifice that few could truly understand, giving up your existence for a chance to save others. Before Yhorm carried out this plan, he turned to Sigurd with a final request. Yhorm possessed another Storm Ruler greatsword. Perhaps he had kept a second one for his own use, or maybe it was a spare held in reserve. Whatever its origin, Yhorm took this giant slaying weapon and placed it in Sigurd's hands. Then he asked his friend to make a promise that would haunt them both. Yhorm knew that becoming a Lord of Cinder was not a simple ending. Lords of Cinder could be resurrected. They could be called back from their rest when the first flame began to fade again. And when they returned, they did not always come back as the heroes they had been. Sometimes they returned twisted, refusing their duty, becoming threats to the very world they had once saved. Yhorm did not want that fate for himself. He did not want to exist as some hollow shell of his former self, wandering in misery or menacing the world he loved. So he asked Sigurd to make a promise. If Yhorm ever strayed from his duty, if he ever returned as something dangerous or lost, Sigurd would be the one to end him. It was an extraordinary request. Yhorm was asking his dearest friend to prepare for the possibility of striking him down. He was asking Sigurd to carry the burden of potentially having to destroy someone he cared about. The Storm Ruler in his hands was not just a gift. It was the instrument of a future mercy that might become necessary. Sigurd agreed and swore the oath that Yhorm asked of him. We can picture how that moment must have unfolded. Two friends standing together in the shadow of impending sacrifice. the massive giant handing a legendary sword to the Onion Knight. Perhaps they shared one last drink together, the kind of simple pleasure that their friendship had been built upon. Perhaps they embraced as much as a giant and a human could embrace. Sigurd would have understood the weight of what he was accepting. This was not something a knight agreed to lightly. Promising to strike down a friend, even to spare them from a terrible fate, requires a special kind of courage. It is easier to promise you will fight beside someone than to promise you will end their suffering if the moment demands it. But Sigurd gave his word, and knights of Katarina kept their promises. For Yhorm, this oath must have brought a strange kind of peace. He knew he was about to walk into the fire and become something other than what he had been. He knew there was a chance he would not find rest, that the cycle of linking would pull him back into existence someday. But now he had a failsafe. He had a friend who would make sure that if things went wrong, they would not stay wrong forever. The goodbye between them would have been the hardest moment either had ever experienced. Yhorm was resolved to save his people no matter the cost. Sigurd was resolved to honor his friend's wishes, no matter how painful they might prove to be. Both of them knew this might be the last time they would speak as friends. Yhorm turned toward his destiny with nothing left to lose. The first flame awaited him, hungry for a soul powerful enough to kindle its dying light. The giant lord was about to make the ultimate sacrifice. But fate is rarely kind to those who give everything for others. And what happened after Yhorm linked the flame would prove to be the cruelest twist of all. Yhorm walked into the fire, knowing he would never walk out, and he did it for people who might not even care. The giant lord had tried everything else. He had fought every battle that could be fought. He had defended his people against every threat his blade could reach. But the profaned flame was beyond his sword, beyond his strength, beyond anything a warrior could solve through combat. The cursed fire kept burning, kept spreading, kept threatening to consume everything he had sworn to protect. There was only one option left, one desperate gamble that might work where everything else had failed. Yhorm would link the first flame. This was not a decision anyone made lightly. Linking the first flame meant walking into the kiln and offering your soul as fuel. It meant burning away everything you were so that the flame could blaze bright again. Lord Gwyn had done it at the dawn of the Age of Fire, and countless others had followed his example through the ages. Every one of them had ceased to exist as they were, becoming something else entirely. Yhorm understood what he was choosing. He knew the agony that awaited him. He knew that his body would be consumed, and his soul would become fuel for a fire that had been burning since the beginning of the world. He knew that the giant lord who had protected the profaned capital would be gone, replaced by ash and cinder and the fading memory of who he had been. And yet he did it anyway. The hope was simple in concept, if terrifying in execution. The profaned flame was a cursed fire tied to the abyss and dark. The first flame was the source of all light and warmth in the world, the original fire from which all others drew their power. If anything could suppress or extinguish the profaned flame, it would be the renewed might of the first flame blazing at full strength. By sacrificing himself, Yhorm would supercharge that ancient fire. His powerful soul would kindle the first flame back to its full glory. And that renewed power might be enough to put the profaned flame to rest once and for all. It was a theory built on desperate hope, constructed from the logic that fire might counter fire. There were no guarantees. There was no certainty that his sacrifice would work. But Yhorm had nothing else to offer his people except himself. The ritual likely took place at the kiln of the first flame or somewhere similar, a sacred place where the boundary between life and fire grew thin. Yhorm would have approached that ancient blaze, knowing he was about to become part of it, every step bringing him closer to the end of his existence as he knew it. When the moment came, the pain must have been beyond description. The first flame did not accept souls gently. It consumed them completely, burning through flesh and spirit with an intensity that dwarfed any ordinary fire. Gwyn himself had been reduced to a hollow shell by this process, spending an eternity as a burned-out husk before finally being released from his torment. Yhorm experienced that same immolation. His massive body, the same body that had stood at the front of every battle, was consumed by the flame. His soul, the essence of who he was, became fuel for the fire that kept the world in light. The giant lord who had given everything for his people gave the last thing he had left. What remained after the ritual was ash and cinder, the physical remains of someone who had once been one of the most powerful beings in the realm. Yhorm's cinders of a lord, as they would come to be known, represented his transition from living ruler to legendary sacrifice. He had joined the ranks of those who had burned for the world. This should have been a moment of triumph, a selfless act of heroism where a giant lord gave his life to save the very humans who once feared him. The ultimate proof that Yhorm was not his ancestor, that a giant could love humanity enough to destroy himself for their sake. The profaned capital should have celebrated their lord's sacrifice with gratitude and reverence. That is not what happened. The lore tells us something heartbreaking about how people responded to Yhorm's sacrifice. Many spoke insincerely of his role as a Lord of Cinder. They did not honor him as a hero who had given everything. They questioned his motives. They whispered that perhaps he had done it for glory or recognition. They could not bring themselves to believe that a giant would truly sacrifice himself for humans out of pure duty and love. Even as Yhorm burned for them, some of his subjects could not see past their old grudges. The history between giants and humans was too heavy, the scars too deep. They looked at his sacrifice and found reasons to doubt instead of reasons to be grateful. This bitter lack of appreciation adds another layer of tragedy to Yhorm's story. He did not just suffer the agony of the linking ritual. He suffered the knowledge that his people might never truly understand why he did it. All of his efforts to prove himself, all of his years of service and protection and sacrifice, and still some of them thought the worst of him. But Yhorm went through with it, regardless of what others might say. He did not sacrifice himself for praise or recognition. He did it because his people needed to be saved, and he was the only one who could save them. Whether they appreciated it or not was beside the point. A true protector does not demand gratitude. A true protector does what needs to be done because it needs to be done. In that moment of linking, Yhorm became everything he had ever aspired to be. The weighty blade and stone-hard shield for his people, taken to its ultimate conclusion. He had promised to defend them with his life, and now he was paying that debt in full. The first flame roared with new power. Yhorm's soul, massive and ancient and full of the strength that had made him a legend, fueled a blaze that had been flickering toward darkness. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like his sacrifice had worked. The profaned capital should have been saved. The cursed flame should have been quelled by the renewed might of the first flame. Yhorm had given everything to make it happen, and everything should have been enough. But the world of dark souls rarely rewards sacrifice with success, and what happened next would prove that even the ultimate act of selflessness cannot always overcome the cruelty of fate. Yhorm became a Lord of Cinder. He joined the ranks of the greatest heroes in history, and he was about to discover that his sacrifice had been for nothing. Picture a city going about its day, people walking through streets they have walked 1,000 times before, merchants selling their goods, children playing in courtyards, and then fire falls from the sky. This was not ordinary fire, but something darker and something hungry. The profaned flame had been waiting. The moment Yhorm's power left the profaned capital, the moment his presence was no longer there to hold it back, the cursed fire struck with everything it had. It fell from above like rain made of hatred, pouring down onto the city in a hellish deluge that defied every natural law. There was no warning. There was no time to prepare. One moment the citizens of the profaned capital were living their lives, and the next moment they were engulfed in an inferno that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Buildings roared with flames that climbed their walls and burst through their windows. Streets became rivers of fire. The sky itself turned the color of ash and ember as the profaned flame consumed everything in its path. This was not a natural disaster. This was something far worse. This was a curse unleashed. And here is where the horror becomes almost incomprehensible. The profaned flame did not burn everything equally. It had a preference and a target that defied all reason. The cursed fire incinerated human flesh and nothing else. Stone buildings stood as flames washed over them, scorched but intact. Metal fixtures survived the inferno without melting. Wooden structures that should have been kindling somehow endured the blaze. But the people, the living, breathing human beings who made the profaned capital their home, they were reduced to ash in moments. The flame hungered specifically for humanity. It sought out people with a terrible purpose, as if the dark that had birthed it wanted nothing more than to erase human life from the city. Families vanished in the span of heartbeats. Entire neighborhoods worth of souls were extinguished before anyone could understand what was happening. This selectivity reveals something deeply disturbing about the nature of the profaned flame. It was not just fire. It was a weapon aimed at a specific target. The abyss and the dark had created something that existed purely to consume human life. And now that weapon was doing exactly what it was designed to do. When the flames finally died down, what remained of the profaned capital was a monument to devastation. Grand halls stood empty, their architecture intact, but their purpose erased. Towers reached toward a darkened sky, their walls blackened but standing, their interiors now home to nothing but silence. The infrastructure of a great city survived while everything that made it a city was gone. Not everyone perished in the flames. The court sorcerers who had practiced their dark arts in the capital's depths emerged from the destruction. The jailer handmaids, those twisted beings who had worshipped the flame itself, walked through the ashes unharmed. These non-human denizens had either been spared by the flame's selective hatred or protected by their own dark connections to the powers that had spawned it. But the ordinary people were gone. From every merchant to every child to every citizen who had learned to trust their giant lord and sleep soundly under his protection, the population of the profaned capital had been erased in a single catastrophic event, leaving behind only their empty homes and the echo of lives cut short. Yhorm's throne sat empty in a palace of ghosts. Try to understand what this meant in the context of everything that came before. Yhorm had given his people the Storm Ruler to prove he was on their side. He had fought at the front of every battle to show them his strength was their shield. He had burned his own soul in the first flame, specifically to stop the profaned flame from destroying his city. And the city was destroyed anyway. The people perished anyway. Every sacrifice, every battle, every gesture of trust had led to this empty city and this dead population. A giant lord who had burned himself alive to save people who were no longer alive to be saved. The timing suggests something cruel about how this unfolded. The profaned flame struck the moment Yhorm was no longer present to oppose it. Some believe the cursed fire was simply waiting for its chance, held at bay by Yhorm's power until he was gone. Others suggest the act of linking the first flame somehow triggered the profaned flame's final assault, as if the two fires were locked in opposition and one's resurgence caused the other to explode outward. Whatever the mechanism, the result was the same. Yhorm's sacrifice had not saved his people. It had merely given him an excuse to not witness their end. The profaned flame, having consumed all the human fuel it could find, settled into a smolder. It did not disappear. A fire cursed never to go out cannot truly be extinguished, even when it has nothing left to burn. The flame lingered in the depths of the ruined capital, a sleeping monster, waiting for its next chance to consume. Years later, a man named Pontiff Suleiman would discover these remnants. He would use the lingering power of the profaned flame to fuel his own dark ambitions, proving that even in its diminished state, the cursed fire remained a force capable of shaping the destiny of nations. The profaned flame never truly ended. It merely waited. From the perspective of history, Yhorm the Giant became a Lord of Cinder. He joined the ranks of those who had saved the world by linking the first flame. His name would be remembered alongside other legendary figures who had made the ultimate sacrifice. But Yhorm did not save his world. He saved the world in general, while losing everything that mattered to him specifically. The profaned capital, which he had devoted his entire existence to protecting, was gone. The people who had chosen a giant to rule them, who had slowly learned to trust him, who had watched him fight and bleed for them, were ashes scattered on empty streets. His throne remained in that dead city, a seat of power overlooking a kingdom of nothing. Everything Yhorm had worked for, everything he had sacrificed for, everything he had loved was gone. This might have been the end of his story, a tragic conclusion to a tragic life. A giant who gave everything and received nothing in return. A martyr whose sacrifice arrived too late to save anyone who mattered. But the cycle of the first flame does not allow for simple endings. Those who become lords of Cinder do not always stay at rest, and fate, it seemed, had more suffering in store for the lonely giant. The capital lay in ash. The people were gone, and somewhere in the void between life and what came after, Yhorm waited without knowing that he would one day be called back to face the ruins of everything he had failed to protect. A bell rang across the world, and in a ruined city, a coffin cracked open. Time moves strangely in the world of dark souls. Centuries might have passed since Yhorm walked into the first flame, or perhaps only decades. The boundaries between ages blur in ways that defy easy measurement. What matters is that eventually, inevitably, the flame began to fade once more. This is how the cycle works. Someone links the fire, the world enjoys an age of light, and then the flame grows weak again. Another soul must be sacrificed. Another Lord of Cinder must burn. The wheel keeps turning no matter how many bodies are thrown beneath it. But this time, something went wrong. Prince Lorthric was supposed to be the next sacrifice. He had been bred for this purpose, raised from birth to accept his destiny as fuel for the first flame. Everything had been prepared for his sacrifice. But Prince Lorthric refused to accept that fate. He looked at the flame that demanded his soul, and he said no. He rejected the duty that his entire existence had been designed to fulfill. And without his sacrifice, the first flame began to sputter and fade in ways it never had before. The world responded with desperation. If the current heir would not link the fire, then perhaps previous lords of Cinder could be convinced to do it again. A bell tolled across all the lands, reaching into graves and tombs where the ashes of former heroes rested. The call went out for the Lords of Cinder to return to their thrones, to rise from their slumber and save the world once more. Yhorm the Giant heard that bell. Deep in the ruins of the profaned capital, in a chamber filled with ash and silence, his coffin began to crack. The giant who had burned himself alive to save his people was being pulled back into existence, whether he wanted it or not. The first flame needed fuel, and the souls of former lords contained power too valuable to leave buried. What emerged from that coffin was not quite the Yhorm who had linked the fire so long ago. His body had become something new. an undead form made of cinder and living ash. Fire gleamed in his eyes where life had once burned. He was a lord of cinder in the most literal sense now, his physical form a testament to what he had sacrificed and what he had become. The opening moments of Dark Souls 3 show us this resurrection. We see Yhorm stirring in darkness, his massive silhouette rising from rest, and then we hear him roar. That sound echoes through the ruins of the profaned capital, bouncing off walls that once sheltered a thriving population. It is not a battle cry or a declaration of triumph. Scholars who have analyzed this moment describe it as something between anger and anguish, a vocalization of pure emotional devastation. Consider what Yhorm experienced in those first moments of awareness. He opened his eyes and saw the charred remains of his kingdom surrounding him. He breathed in air thick with the ash of his former subjects. The memories of his sacrifice came flooding back, followed immediately by the realization that it had all been for nothing. His people were gone, and his city was a ruin. The profaned flame that he had burned himself to stop had consumed everything anyway. Every battle he fought, every trust he earned, every gesture of sacrifice had led to this moment of standing alone in the graveyard of his own failure. And now the world wanted him to do it again. The bell that had awakened him carried a summons. Lords of Cinder were expected to return to Firelink Shrine and offer themselves to the first flame once more. They were supposed to link the fire again, to burn their resurrected souls for another temporary reprieve from darkness. The cycle demanded their obedience. Some lords answered that call. Ludleth of Corland, another lord of Cinder, sat waiting at Firelink Shrine, ready to fulfill his duty despite the cost. He understood what was being asked and accepted it as necessary. But Yhorm did not answer that call. The giant looked at the summons he had received and made a different choice. He would not sacrifice himself again. He would not burn for a world that had taken everything from him. He would not play the role of obedient fuel for a flame that could not even protect the people he loved. Yhorm sat down on his throne in the profaned capital and refused to move. This was not the behavior of a villain. This was the behavior of someone who had lost all reason to continue. Yhorm had given everything he had the first time around. His soul, his life, his future, all burned away in the hope of saving his city. And the city had burned anyway. What possible motivation could he have for repeating that experience? The world called him reclusive. They remembered him as Yhorm the Giant, Lord of Cinder, and reclusive ruler of the profaned capital. That title captured something true about his situation. He had withdrawn from the world because the world had nothing left to offer him. In his throne room, surrounded by the ashes of his people and the distant glow of the profaned flame, still smouldering in the depths of his ruined city, Yhorm waited. Not for salvation, not for another chance at glory. He waited for an end. His refusal to answer the call made him a target. When lords of Cinder do not come willingly, their cinders must be taken by force. The Ashen One, the player character of Dark Souls 3, would eventually be tasked with hunting down Yhorm and claiming what remained of his power. The giant who had once been a hero was now an obstacle to be overcome. But even in his defiance, Yhorm deserves understanding. His refusal came from heartbreak and hopelessness, not from malice or ambition. Other lords of Cinder who rejected the call had different motivations. Aldrich consumed the gods out of twisted hunger. The Abyss Watchers tore themselves apart in eternal conflict. Yhorm simply sat in silence, waiting for the suffering to end. When the Ashen One eventually reaches his throne room, they find him seated and still. He does not attack until provoked. He does not threaten or monologue or explain himself. He simply exists in his grief, a monument to failure and loss, until someone forces him to respond. In his second life, Yhorm had truly become the lonely giant. No subjects to protect, no friend to share a drink with, no purpose beyond waiting for the release that his immortal form would not grant on its own. The title that had once reflected his position among people who feared him now reflected something far more tragic. He was alone in every sense that mattered, and he would remain alone until someone came to finish what the first flame had started so long ago. The stage was set for the final confrontation. Somewhere out in the world, an old friend was preparing to keep a promise made in better times. And somewhere in the ruins of everything he had failed to save, Yhorm the giant sat on his throne, waiting for the end he could not give himself. Somewhere in the world, an onion knight was making his way toward the hardest thing he would ever have to do. Sigurd of Katarina had heard the bells. He knew what they meant. The lords of Cinder were being called back to their thrones, and that meant Yhorm had risen from his grave in the profaned capital. The friend he had said goodbye to so long ago was alive again, sitting in the ruins of his kingdom, refusing to answer the call, which meant the promise was coming due. Sigurd had carried that oath with him through all the years since Yhorm's sacrifice. The Storm Ruler sword that his friend had entrusted to him was never far from his side. He had hoped he would never need to use it. He had hoped that when Yhorm linked the fire, that would be the end of it. A hero's rest for a hero's sacrifice. But the cycle of fire does not allow for peaceful endings. And now Sigurd had a duty to fulfill. The journey to the profaned capital was not a simple one. Dark Souls 3 chronicles the obstacles Sigurd faced along the way, and they paint a picture of a determined knight who refused to let anything stop him from keeping his word. He crossed treacherous lands. He fought through dangers that would have turned back lesser warriors. And yes, he got stuck in a well at one point, because even the bravest knights can have moments of bumbling misfortune. The Ashen One encounters Sigurd multiple times during their own journey. These meetings reveal glimpses of the knight's mission without fully explaining it. Sigurd speaks of having a grave promise to keep. He mentions the home of Yhorm, the reclusive giant lord. The weight of what he must do hangs over every conversation, even when his cheerful demeanor tries to hide it. At one point, Sigurd ends up imprisoned in the dungeons of Irithyll, captured by forces that sought to prevent him from reaching his destination. Even this setback could not stop him. With help from the Ashen One, he escaped and continued his march toward the profaned capital. Nothing would keep him from honoring the oath he had sworn to his dearest friend. What must have been going through his mind during those final steps? Sigurd was walking toward a confrontation he had dreaded for ages. He was preparing to face someone he cared about deeply and do something that would break his heart. The Storm Ruler in his hands was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of the trust Yhorm had placed in him, a trust that now demanded a terrible price. The Ashen One reaches Yhorm's throne room in the depths of the profaned capital. The giant sits upon his throne, massive and silent, surrounded by the ashes of everything he failed to protect. This is the moment the entire game has been building toward for this particular Lord of Cinder. The confrontation that will determine whether Yhorm's cinders can be claimed for the first flame. And then Sigurd appears. If the Ashen One has helped the knight throughout their journey, if they have freed him from his various predicaments and aided his progress, Sigurd arrives just as the battle is about to begin. He steps into the throne room and faces the giant who was once his closest friend. The moment is one of the most emotionally powerful scenes in all of Dark Souls 3. Sigurd addresses Yhorm directly. He calls him old friend, acknowledging the bond they shared before everything fell apart. He announces himself formally as Sigurd of the Knights of Katarina, invoking the traditions of his homeland in this most solemn moment. And then he declares his purpose. He has come to uphold his promise. He asks that the sun shine upon this Lord of Cinder, a blessing meant to honor Yhorm even as it signals what must happen next. Those words carry so much weight. This is not a battle cry from an enemy. This is a farewell from a friend. Sigurd is not there to defeat a monster or claim glory for himself. He is there to give Yhorm the release that the giant cannot find on his own. He is there to keep a promise. The confrontation brings together threads that have been woven throughout Yhorm's entire story. The Storm Ruler's swords, those legendary giant-slaying weapons, are finally about to serve their purpose. Sigurd brandishes the blade that Yhorm gave him before linking the fire. The Ashen One can claim the other Storm Ruler from beside Yhorm's throne, the same weapon the giant had given to his people as proof of his trustworthiness. Two Storm Rulers now stood ready for battle, both of them gifts from Yhorm himself, and both of them now aimed at the giant who distributed them. There is a tragic poetry in this arrangement. Yhorm had handed out these weapons, knowing exactly what they were capable of. He had given his people and his friend the tools to destroy him, trusting that they would only use them if he deserved it. Now, in the ruins of his failed kingdom, that trust is being honored in the most painful way possible. Yhorm rises from his throne to face the warriors before him. Whatever remains of his consciousness must recognize what is happening. His old friend stands ready with the sword he gave him. The promise he asked Sigurd to make is about to be fulfilled. The end he has been waiting for is finally at hand. The battle itself is unique among Dark Souls boss fights. Yhorm is massive and powerful, nearly invincible against ordinary weapons. His attacks can devastate anyone who tries to face him conventionally. When charged with their ancient power, these swords unleash devastating blasts of wind that can stagger even the mightiest giant. The very weapons Yhorm distributed as symbols of trust become the instruments of his release. Sigurd fights alongside the Ashen One, both of them wielding the power that Yhorm himself provided. The knight who had dreaded this moment for so long now commits fully to the task. He swings his Storm Ruler with the same determination that brought him through every obstacle on his journey. He does what he promised to do, no matter how much it hurts. This is what loyalty looks like in the world of Dark Souls. Not the easy kind of loyalty that costs nothing, the kind that demands everything. Sigurd could have ignored the bells. He could have pretended he never made that promise. He could have let someone else deal with Yhorm and spared himself the pain of facing his friend. Instead, he walked into that throne room and did what needed to be done. Because that is what Knights of Katarina do. They keep their word, even when keeping it destroys something precious inside them. The throne room shook as the giant rose to his feet. Yhorm stood wreathed in cinders, his massive form towering over the warriors who had come to claim his soul. Flame flickered in his eyes and danced across his body, the remnants of his sacrifice given physical form. In his hands, he gripped the great machete, that same weapon he had modified so long ago when grief took his shield away. The notches in its handle were still there, carved by a giant who had lost everything and decided to fight with nothing held back. He was magnificent and terrible all at once. The battle began with sweeping attacks that made the ground tremble. Yhorm's machete carved through the air in massive arcs, each swing powerful enough to shatter stone. The Ashen One quickly discovered what made this fight different. Ordinary weapons bounced off Yhorm's body with barely a scratch. Swords that had felled demons could do almost nothing against this Lord of Cinder. Yhorm had always been a giant among giants, and in this final confrontation, he proved why his people had once feared him, as every movement radiated power and every strike threatened devastation. but he had given the world the tools to bring him down. The Storm Ruler swords were the only weapons that could truly harm him. When charged with their ancient power, these blades unleashed devastating gusts of wind that cut through Yhorm's defenses. The Ashen One raised their Storm Ruler, channeled its fury, and sent a tempest screaming toward the giant. And beside the Ashen One stood Sigurd, wielding the Storm Ruler that Yhorm himself had entrusted to him all those years ago. Two warriors facing one giant. Two storm-forged swords against one Lord of Cinder. Yhorm had distributed these weapons as proof of his good intentions. He had armed his people and his friend with the means to destroy him. Now, in the ashes of his ruined kingdom, that trust was being honored. Sigurd fought with determination and sorrow in equal measure. Every swing of his blade carried the weight of his promise. He was not fighting an enemy, but releasing a friend from suffering that had gone on far too long. The battle raged across the throne room. Yhorm struck back with fiery fury, his Lord of Cinder power blazing as he refused to fall easily. He absorbed storm strike after storm strike, retaliating with earth-shaking blows. Even facing weapons designed to destroy him, Yhorm proved he was a warrior worthy of legend. But no giant can stand forever against the Storm Rulers. The final blow sent Yhorm crashing to the floor. The great giant let out a sound that might have been a groan of pain or perhaps a sigh of relief. After everything he had endured, the end had finally come. The promise Sigurd made was fulfilled. The peace Yhorm could not find on his own had been delivered. His body began to disintegrate almost immediately. True to his nature as a Lord of Cinder, Yhorm's physical form broke apart into ash and embers. His cinders of a lord passed to the Ashen One. That power would eventually be used to link the first flame, fulfilling the duty Yhorm had refused to perform a second time. In a way, Yhorm's sacrifice finally mattered. His cinders would help save the world, even if the world he had personally loved was long gone. But the story does not end with Yhorm's fall. Sigurd, having fulfilled his oath, knelt beside his fallen friend. The knight thanked the Ashen One for their help and expressed bittersweet relief that Yhorm could finally rest. And then Sigurd sat down, closed his eyes, and joined his friend in peace. The knight passed away there in the throne room, his long quest finally complete. Perhaps he simply had nothing left to live for. Perhaps the weight of what he had done was too heavy. Or perhaps he chose to stay with Yhorm. Whatever the reason, both sides of the ancient oath ended in that room. The profaned capital, already silent, became the final resting place for two friends. A giant and a knight, bound by loyalty that transcended the boundaries between their races. They had found each other in a world that gave them every reason to be enemies, and they stayed together until the very end. This is how the story of Yhorm the Giant concludes. He began as the descendant of a conqueror, born into a legacy of tyranny and subjugation. He rose to become a selfless ruler who gave his people the weapon to destroy him, who fought at the front of every battle, who earned respect through sacrifice and duty. He fell when the profaned flame consumed everything he loved despite his ultimate sacrifice. He rose again in despair, refusing to serve a cycle that had taken everything from him. And he found peace at last through the faithfulness of a friend who loved him enough to let him go. Yhorm is remembered as one of the Lords of Cinder who defied the call. His name carries a mix of reverence and myth, the story of a giant who tried to change what his kind meant to humanity. He failed to save his people. He failed to stop the flame that destroyed them. But he succeeded in proving that a giant could be more than a monster. He succeeded in earning a friendship that lasted beyond reason. He succeeded in facing the end with dignity, surrounded not by enemies, but by those who cared. The lonely giant was lonely no more in his final moments. His story stands as one of the most tragic in all of Dark Souls, a tale of powerful loyalty between unlikely friends, a tale of costly redemption that came too late to save what mattered most, a tale that reflects the cyclic nature of light and dark, where heroes burn themselves away and the world keeps turning regardless. But it is also a tale of something rare in this bleak universe, of connection and trust and the bonds that form when two souls recognize something worthy in each other, despite every reason to stay apart. Yhorm gave everything for people who doubted him. He burned for a world that forgot him, and in the end, he was remembered not for his failures, but for the friendship that brought him peace. The fire fades, and the cycle continues, and lords rise and fall as they always have. But some stories deserve to be told, and the story of Yhorm the Giant, the reclusive lord of the Profaned capital, is one that will echo through the ages as long as anyone remembers what it means to sacrifice everything for those you love. Rest now, lonely giant. Your watch has ended.